This is the word of the Lord.
Another jolly reading, right? Must be the season we're going through, something like that. There's some good stuff here. Because the period at the start of the 6th century BCE, which is the time that Jeremiah was speaking, was a pretty tricky time for the people of Israel. The neighbouring empires had grown dramatically in economic power and in their military prowess, and the relatively small and peaceful crescent of land that Israel had settled upon had become like a corridor between these two regional superpowers. The Egyptians were in the south, that whole empire down there, and in the north there was first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians. And Israel really felt the squeeze quite often, sometimes attempting to play one side off against the other, and sadly in the process they forgot where their true security had always been. How did they get into such a tricky situation? Had God done something wrong? Was there a stuff-up in which God did something that was inconsistent with his faithful love? What was it that caused the people of Judah to drift away from their God? And it's as though Jeremiah would have been able to understand the people abandoning their faithfulness to God if in fact God had been unfaithful to the people, or even if God had done something the people didn't like. But actually, that wasn't the case. God had always been, and continued to be completely faithful to the people and to God's loving divine nature. But of course, this is a bit more slippery for us to grasp from our own perspective, because we have our own ideas of what it means to be loved, and we develop our own native sense of what justice looks like, and we are prone to become dissatisfied with what's going on or our lot in life, and we do tend to assess our own actions as justifiable. At least at base they're acceptable to ourselves, because otherwise we wouldn't have done them. And when things don't go the way we hope, we are prone to blame someone else rather than to take responsibility. And there's all sorts of understandable social evolutionary explanations for these kinds of reflex that we have in us. But as soon as we go with that reflex, we confirm to all around us and within our own being actually, that it's what other people think and believe that matters more to us than what is true. And at that point, we are kind of done for, I think. So Jeremiah challenged the people. Did God abandon you? Really? Did you genuinely call out to God to no avail? Perhaps you were just fooling yourselves, going through the motions. Maybe your heart wasn't in it. I have 2 teenage daughters, and I also have been a teenager, and I know just how easy it is to fool ourselves. For example, we are looking for something when in fact our attention is really on something else. The number of times Pay says to me, "Dad, I can't find such and such," and I walk in and there it is. Did you look? We know that, right? We can all do that. And the people of Judah seemed to think that they had looked for God and somehow God was nowhere to be found. To hear them tell it, it was God who had wandered off somewhere, not them. And just when the crisis came and they really needed God the most, nothing. But this turns out to be a little bit like that drunk fella who's staggering around a lamppost late at night, and a copper on patrol observes the man and starts to question him. "Hello, hello, hello," because he's a British copper, of course. "What's going on here then?" And the drunk fellow looks up and smiles and says, "I'm looking for my keys." And he says, "Oh, righto then, I'll give you a hand." And they search around the lamp for about 10 minutes, and the copper eventually says, "You know what, your keys aren't here. Are you sure you dropped them here?" And he went, "Oh no, I dropped them over there, but it was too dark to look over there." But too often we narrow our field of concern to where we are interested in looking. We don't find what we're looking for because it simply is not there to be found, which is not to say it is nowhere to be found. It's simply not where we're willing to look. Instead of seeking God, the people of Judah had followed the lead of the people who had always lived in Canaan, or before they'd got there, in their small tribal groupings. And these locals had their own traditions and their own gods, deities, who they believed watched over their crops and their weather patterns and the fertility of their soil and all the basic essentials of livelihood in that region. So, quite naturally, the more recent arrivals would look to those who had been in the land for generations to get a sense of how they'd managed to survive for that long in that place. But this came with some inbuilt superstitions and problematic practices, some straight out socially violent and destructive things as well. Rather than fostering their own traditions, born of the liberation from slavery and escape from oppression and God's gracious provision and the promise of a rich future and the recognition of every member in the community being a full and equal participant, all revolutionary ideas at that time, there was a constant temptation to cave in to a more deeply entrenched local tradition that, after all, appeared to have worked for many, many generations before they'd got there. But Israel had become a nation by virtue of a very distinct process of liberation. Certainly their intertribal connections had far-reaching familial ties. They were the children of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, their revered patriarchs. But when it came to being formed as a nation, it was actually the shared experience of the exodus from Egypt that was the undisputed seminal formational journey. In this story, a mixed company, not simply the descendants of the patriarchs, came together in response to their shared sense of need and, most importantly, their shared response to the call of God. They had been a slave community for their entire lives in Egypt. Their forebears had not all been slaves. However, the generation who came out of Egypt in the Exodus knew nothing other than slavery as their identity. So it was vital for them to be reoriented in their lives regarding who they were. God needed to form them as God's people, not as slaves, which is one of the benefits of the wilderness, because the people journeyed through a completely unfamiliar environment and had to learn to be utterly trusting in the God who was leading them. And during this period, they were being tutored in what it meant to be faithful to the one who had called them forth out of their captivity. There's a sense in which they had no right to expect they would survive such hostile terrain. I think in the reading that Mal offered us, it said something, nobody lived there because you couldn't live there. And yet, step by step, their God supplied everything they needed. The people had no capacity to manipulate the outcomes of particular things. They were quite dependent, and they had to listen and then do what they were instructed to do. And as soon as they thought they had a better idea than God's, they discovered their alternate direction was actually doing themselves harm. The wilderness was a good environment for training in faithfulness to God, but it wasn't the place that they were destined to settle and to grow into a nation and to live. There was a far better place that they were being taken to, a place that had the potential for genuine abundance, a place flowing with milk and honey, it is said. And while, of course, both milk and honey are found in their own particular natural environments, a land flowing with these tokens of the good life suggests a settled security in which practices of cultivation could be developed. The God of Israel did indeed deliver the people out of Egypt through the unique challenges of the wilderness and into the promised land. And while their appear to have been some notable skirmishes in that process, in what today is easy to interpret as an invasion. There's a growing scholarly consensus, I think, and evidence to back it up, that the arriving tribes of Israel were cautiously welcomed by many of the pre-existing tribes in this uniquely fertile land. Because you'll remember, Israel did not come as a nation under a king. They were a loose confederate of tribes as they came out of Egypt, held by a fundamentally egalitarian system of rituals and beliefs, in which God was not in the form of a human king or an emperor, but God was over and above all the people, and all the people stood on an equal footing before the ultimate power. This was both fairly unique and powerfully liberating at the time. It's not crazy to imagine many tribes, people quickly appreciating the benefits of this strange new way of doing cooperative community together. And that seems to be, there's very little evidence of lots of battles in the archaeological discoveries of that period in Israel going into that land. Just something to think about. History, however, does reveal that after many generations on from that moment when they initially arrived in the land, this time that Jeremiah is in, after a royal court had indeed been established, so they arrived without a king, but not too long afterwards they thought a king might be a good idea, even though that was just imitating the nations that surrounded them. It was against the expressed wishes of God. The people continued to lean into being more and more like the other tribes that had predated their arrival in the land. And rather than being the transforming presence Israel had started out being, the transformation process had switched the other way. The people whose faithfulness to God had been formed by their wilderness wanderings were subsequently kind of deformed by their fascination with tangible security and material comforts. Who can't relate to that, right? Their attention was turned to the ways of the local tribes, whose rituals and practices they supposed would enhance these important aspects of life, security and comfort. The people of Israel seemed to forget that God had offered to them both security and well-being quite directly at the very beginning, and instead they came to decide that these were more readily secured in other places. The people began to participate in the local fertility customs. Now, in our day, we might think, well, that's pretty open-minded of them, really, some kind of generosity of heart, hospitality, engage deeply with the local customs, that kind of thing. But it also came with other influences. Given that most of the ancient fertility cultic practices included sexual activity with cultic prostitutes, and sometimes even more violent rituals, including the offering of human babies as living sacrifices, these practices are repeatedly condemned by the prophetic tradition in Israel, and yet all the evidence suggests they persisted as practices in Israel for the entire time, right up until the people were ultimately exiled into Babylon. My friend sent me a cartoon this week. In it, there's a man who says, "Always seek the approval of others. It fills the emptiness inside you. It also makes the emptiness larger, so it can hold more approval." It's funny because it's true. We chase a thing because we believe it's what we need, but much like the impact of that saying, or indeed drugs or certain other things that we chase after, they actually increase our dependence on those things. They don't fill us up. Rather than making us secure or experience a fulfilling life, history tells that in this situation, the story of God's people became ever more erratic in their behaviour and increasingly detached from their formative traditions. Their culture drifted towards practices and beliefs that were simply never going to satisfy them. Rather than being the unique people of God, whose very presence was an eloquent call to any and all that if they came into a covenant relationship with the living God, they would do well. They opted instead to work at being just like everybody else. Now, I get that that can be a pretty nuanced challenge these days, because we're not sure always how God is calling us to be unique, and there are those things we want to do to build relationships with people who aren't part of our community of faith already, and we want to share with them, and so we want to be like them enough to make those connections, but different enough to be unique, and it can be tricky. How are we specifically to be unique, and where does God shine through? What is absent from the cultures that do not acknowledge God that we do have in our culture that does acknowledge God? And I reckon the most fundamental thing is this incredible gracious love. Now, it does exist in other places, but this is the thing that is so unique to the story that we are part of. The giving of ourselves to one another. That's what makes life rich. Rather than the instinctual taking of things to try and prolong our own survival and comfort and security. Jeremiah was appalled. The people God had called, the ones he'd rescued and established in a place of abundance, had turned aside from God. The people preferred instead to follow and become just like everyone else around them. And many deeply encoded cultural practices, the many deeply encoded cultural practices that I'm referring to in the, excuse me, my notes, because there's some tricky words here. The many deeply encoded cultural practices here, I'm not referring to the particular prohibitions against things like eating mollusks or shellfish, that are these obscure laws that are often in the tradition, but the laws and rituals that continue to remind the people of who they were in relation to their God. These were the things that they were abandoning. And in their place, the people had come to believe it was better to simply go along with the other tribes around them, go along so as to get along with everyone. And the tragic irony being, it had always been Israel's uniqueness and the remarkable holiness or otherness of their God that had been Israel's true security and strength. Having become just like everybody else, they were soon overrun by world history forces just like everybody else. The prophecy of Jeremiah is not a comfortable read. We'll be dipping into it a little bit, I think. My apologies. It challenges the very heart of what it means to be the people of God. Being the people of God turns out to be not about family line, or where you were born, or even the land that you live in. It turns out, perhaps obviously enough, being the people of God is all about a genuine relationship with God. No tokenism, no pretending, genuine faith, hope and love. And where we look for those sustaining elements in our life. Today we face much the same challenge of being swept along with everybody else. The instinct to belong runs deep within us. We like to be part of the crowd. But it is easily harnessed, that temptation or instinct in us is easily harnessed by bullies and those who want to use our life for their own benefit. I encourage us instead to continue to submit ourselves to the truly ultimate power, the one who is the very embodiment of love. In a moment we will break bread together and remind one another that we are together the body of Christ, the one who gave himself utterly to us and for us. Let us again commit ourselves to follow Jesus, for Jesus is the only one who will lead us in this genuinely life-sustaining way to the glory of his name. Amen.